Joining us now for more, we're joined by Dylan Bester, Director at Phoenix Private Wealth International, and Tertia Jacobs, Treasury Economist at Investec, Corporate and Institutional Banking. And joining us on the line shortly is Peter Attard Montalto, economist at Nomura International. Peter, let's begin with you, and because you're on the line and ready for us. We had the lots of reaction today from local players to this summons served on the finance minister. From your perspective, you know these people well. You've visited the country frequently to get insight. What is your reaction to this move?
Hi, good afternoon. I think the real issue here is that the market has been sort of caught off guard by this move. I think the market has sort of lulled itself into a false sense of security, particularly given the ABI, SAB Miller related inflows that were occurring, that somehow political risk premium wasn't required, that there were too many political sort of power constraints on Zuma from acting in this sort of way, and that there wasn't particularly a case against Pravin Gordhan. And I think what we've learned from today is that actually those assumptions the market made were not correct, that there is a degree of, if you like, a need for action from various factions and camps within the ANC, and we're now seeing the results of that move forward with these charges about to be laid before Pravin Gordhan, and that story sort of grinding forward as a result.
If I can join in here, Peter, it's Gugu here with David here in Johannesburg. Reading your note earlier today and your analysis of the situation, you say that this reveals more about the factions within the ANC than influence with regard to the stability of national treasury as well as South Africa's fiscal focus.
Exactly. I think we need to zoom out and sort of consider that the charges in and of themselves are not really the issue here. What it's about is access to power, access to money, and access to the institution of national treasury, and how it can be used to sort of sway the internal battles and succession battle that's now ongoing within the ANC. And that's really what this is all about. I think if you just zoom in and think about the charges, it sort of becomes a slightly sort of micro issue. But when you sort of do zoom out, then other things like, for instance, the Public Protector report that is due to come by Friday start becoming very important, and the sort of larger political risk narrative in South Africa starts to become more obvious, and that's till now what the market hasn't particularly done.
Peter, the markets generally, confidence, investors, what is the reaction going to be to this?
Well, I think there's still a sort of residual positives are feeling out there because carry is so high, because particularly other peers like Turkey have seen much lower carry more recently, and people are sort of scraping around looking to sort of hang on to what are very large, long positions in South Africa, and that's why people are sort of hanging on with their fingernails. But I think that means that kind of positioning, which let's not forget is the opposite to what happened into Nenegate. Nenegate people were sort of max short South African assets, offshore people in particular. It means that if there is a proper shock coming, like Pravin Gordhan being reshuffled out, like maybe mass cabinet resignations on the Public Protector report coming out, I think that means that there will be a very, very much bigger and more negative reaction in the currency and in asset prices.
Peter, we'll stay with you on the line to continue getting analysis from you, especially given the international opinion. But we're also joined in studio by Tertia Jacobs, a Treasury Economist at Investec, Corporate and Institutional Banking, and Dylan Bester of Phoenix Capital. Tertia, I want to get your reaction and a response as well to the situation at hand. But more importantly, does this put us at increased risk of a December downgrade?
You know, Gugu, when you look back in June, after Moody's and S&P gave us a reprieve, we thought the probability of a rating cut is probably around about 35%. Then we had this kind of development again surfacing in August, and we increased the probability to 50-50. Then the past week there were comments in a conference by S&P and Moody's, and our impression was that they will not cut our rating. Yes, the focus is on slow growth, lack of SOC reform, warning about the impact of political tensions on growth. So today's developments have again underscored the impact of political risk on confidence, policy, uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So a lot can happen up to December, right? The political situation is very fluid. So yes, the probability has probably increased again, but we still have the medium-term budget policy that will be tabled. We will get a better idea. We don't know if Mr. Gordhan will be suspended or not. I think that will be a bigger risk. So I don't think it means, it's just the risks remain very elevated.
Let's bring Dylan in here. Dylan, I've talked, as I said earlier, about a period of stable uncertainty that we've had. The Hawks issue never went away, but nothing happened. So we kind of thought that maybe things would go on like this. Now, we just saw that chart of the rand there. It hasn't crashed by as much as it crashed when Nene was fired in December, which was about a full rand to the dollar, if you can calculate the political impact. This one's about 50 to 60 cents, I think, from yesterday's level, which was 13.70 odd, and so we saw there trading at 14.32. So not as bad, but a huge fall.
Oh, most certainly. I mean, if you have a look at the rand at the moment, it's come from a level where we've seen this whole political risk being taken out a few months ago, and we saw a lot of premium coming through on the back of US Fed interest rates being lowered, while expectations being lowered, and that being pushed out until possibly end of November, beginning December. So with the likes of US interest rates staying lower for longer, investors from net offshore have come into South Africa looking for that premium risk and yield, which is currently the environment an international investor is looking for, is yield premium.
Yeah.
Maybe yield premium will continue working for us. But before we do get some insight as to how Pravin Gordhan reacted to this morning's announcement, Peter, to come back to you very briefly and staying with the theme of international investors, this comes literally a week after the finance minister as well as well-respected CEOs here in South Africa traveled to the US, Washington and New York in particular, to instill confidence in these investors to continue their focus on South Africa. Do you think today's events will alter their positioning?
Well, I think there was a lot of skepticism from investors in New York after the roadshow last week that really, if you like, Pravin Gordhan was sort of master of his own destiny on these political issues, which ultimately are down to these, as I said, these internal factions and fights that go on within the ANC. So I think there was a degree of skepticism anyway from investors in New York and investors that met South Africa Roadshow in the IMF meetings as well. And this will really just underscore that, I think, and show that there are larger forces at work. I think the rating question will be the ultimate sort of nail in the coffin of which direction this actually takes for South Africa. And the agency is in a very difficult place. I think where they've basically given too much benefit of the doubt, waiting for structural reforms that are unlikely to come forward to meaningfully boost growth and are very difficult in this kind of political environment. So I don't think after today we can sort of assign any particularly higher probability of structural reforms coming, and that ultimately is rating negative.
Right, we'll just pause on our studio conversation and with Peter and have a look at Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, his reaction to the NPA summons.
There's been news spreading around that this entity called the Hawks are at it again. So I want you first to know from me what I know of, the little that I know about events this morning. Firstly, I get a call from my family to say that a Brigadier Kaba, uninvited, has appeared at my house to hand me summons. They know who my lawyer is. That firm of attorney has been interacting with them for months now. And one of the undertakings they gave is that when and if this day comes, they will approach the lawyer and make the necessary arrangements for me to receive any summons that they wish to receive. Not having found me at home, they proceed to go to the Treasury. And I'm not sure what has happened there. Given fiscal austerity, they might not have been given a cup of tea. My lawyers will issue a proper statement in a short while. But, ladies and gentlemen, you and the public need to once again ask yourselves, what is this matter that is so urgent? And I'll tell you what it is. That requires us as a country 15 days before the delivery of the medium-term budget policy statement. So you remember the last time it was just before and after the February budget. There's something attractive about budgets. I'm not sure what it is. So what is it about this country and some in this country, both at a political level and in the law enforcement agencies, who choose these times to do these things? When we've just come back telling all sorts of people, we're fine in South Africa. Yes, no, we have, gloomy growth, but we can see green shoots. We can see the economy growing. And our message to all sorts of investors and people who want to assess our economic performance and fiscal performance is that if you give us another year or so, we'll show you South Africa can change, South Africa can adapt, South Africa can produce results which will not require anybody to consider putting us into so-called junk territory, something that will benefit all South Africans, not just a few. So I expect I will be, at some stage, handed a summons to appear in court on, I believe, on the 2nd of November. A date has been set to collect my fingerprints. They've been in the system for a long time. I suppose they need to freshen it up in some way. But this is a moment when South Africans should really ask themselves, who are the hawks, or these few people in the hawks, really serving? Where do they get their political instructions from, and for what purpose? When all that we are trying to do within the Treasury is represent South Africa, make sure we manage its finances properly, present the best foot forward that we can on behalf of the country, and do that which is right, whether it is in respect of university fees, or more housing to be built, or more money to be made available for the right kind of procurement purposes, or anything that a normal treasury does in any normal country. So, looks like we're in for a bit of excitement as we go forward.
Peter Attard Montalto still on the line there. Well, for an impromptu response to something he wasn't expecting, it was a rather presidential response from the Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, and asking very pertinent questions, Peter, about the timing of the serving of these summons. The head of the National Prosecuting Authority insisting no political interference. Does anyone believe that?
Well, that's the challenge we have sort of looking at this situation, is that on the surface, this is a rule of law issue which should be allowed to continue, and that's actually what the ANC has said. But I think the problem is travelling to South Africa so much and talking to people around the places that you definitely get the sense that the battle is going on within the ANC, and the succession battle that has already started, and how that basically plays into the use of various levers of the state. And that's why ultimately I think we can come out and say that this is happening for political reasons. But I think the narrative that is trying to be constructed, of course, is to distance this from the president to allow a reshuffle ultimately to happen. Though we have to, of course, remember we've had a reshuffle hanging over us, a larger reshuffle, for a year and a half now, even. So there's still a long time potentially for Zuma to wait before that actually happens.
Peter, we'll have to leave it there for today regarding your analysis. Hope this brings you to South Africa a lot sooner than anticipated, but we'll continue with our post-analysis of today's events regarding the Finance Minister receiving a summons from the National Prosecuting Authority.
Well, with us, Dylan Bester, Director at Phoenix Private Wealth International, and Tertia Jacobs, Treasury Economist at Investec, Corporate and Institutional Banking. Tertia, this is the kind of time when I think people in your position and Dylan's position have to earn your money within your organisation, because they turn to you and they say, right, what's going to happen now? What must we think? What are the indicators that you are looking at? Bond movements, yields on bonds, currencies? What are you looking at now so that you can inform the organisation what's happening here?
So the one thing I think that makes it obviously very difficult is the high level of volatility. As Peter indicated, the market actually became very complacent prior to this because we thought Mr. Pravin is safe and we've got the medium-term budget policy, we focused. So what then happens is that risk premiums tend to get narrowed. So we always advise that in this kind of environment where the politics are fluid, international dynamics, yes, volatility has come in following Brexit. Demand for high-yielding bonds has supported our rand and our bond market. We must always be careful for a compressed risk premium. So in our view, and I think last time we were on the show as well, we just warned that we will not be increasing exposure at bond yields where they were prior to the sell-off, because then valuations were not that stretched, but they were no longer inexpensive. So I think what's happening now is in this kind of sell-off, volatility creates opportunities. When you look at the South African fundamentals, depending on where the rand is heading, on the international side, the dollar is range bound. It could perhaps become a little bit stronger. The ECB, the Fed, could hike rates as soon as December. So there will be some uncertainty, but no one expects bond yields to rise aggressively. And from that perspective, you have seen support for emerging market local currency debt. So our bond yields have increased by about 23 basis points this year, but it wasn't like a sustainable sell-off like what we saw in December. So the inflation outlook, again, depending on where the rand is heading, could be peaking towards the end of next year. Yes, where the rand is going could obviously have a bearing going forward. Whereas, so from that perspective then, the Reserve Bank could potentially be on hold unless there's going to be a major fallout from the political side and we get a massive liquidation of our assets. So if that kind of scenario, which is our base case scenario, holds, then bond yields round about these levels are not unappealing. So I think that is the dynamic that's supporting our market.
Dylan, if we come to you and your investment decisions, I know you often look offshore, but if we look at today's banking index, also taking a beating, it was down by more than 5% at some point today. If you look at banks in South Africa, under pressure, valuations have been coming back slightly, and banks offshore are also not looking too appealing, as given the uncertainty with Wells Fargo and Deutsche Bank. So as an investor who wants to put their money in this particular sector, what do you do?
I mean, if you look at an offshore US perspective, I mean, the one actual index today in the banking sector in the US is up. It's basically up on the back of possible rate hikes. So the banking sector overseas is looking for a yield and rate increase because they're going to, obviously, they will be able to retain and earn more. But if you look at from an overseas perspective coming into South Africa, I mean, and on the local banking environment, I'm trying to understand whether we will, and maybe you can help me here, is if we see an actual rate hike coming from the Fed in December, do you think our Treasury will push forward and say, look, we're also in a rate hike cycle. Should we also start increasing rates to keep competitive in this environment from an international perspective?
I think the response would obviously be how the rand performs. I think on the Fed side, they would like to try and contain market volatility, so they will communicate it well. They will also, I think, we're waiting for the FOMC minutes this evening. That will provide us some guidance about their thinking. But at the same time, I can't really see them wanting to get a steeper yield curve from that perspective, because the mortgage bonds are priced from the sovereign yield curve, which is supporting the housing market. So I think they will be very careful in communicating that rates will not be hiked aggressively. I think the only risk now is basically that inflation can perhaps accelerate. Interesting, with the oil price now back above $52 per barrel, this time last year, the crude oil price was much lower. So you'll see that coming through to headline inflation. So how will that affect their policy stance? Sorry, I'm perhaps giving you a bit more detail here, but when you look at what the Fed funds futures are pricing in, the market is saying we only expect the Fed to hike interest rates 3 times by 25 basis points over the next 3 years. So if that assumption is wrong, there is the risk of more volatility, and that can obviously have an impact on emerging market currencies such as the rand, as the ZAR, because the dollar will strengthen on that scenario. But I don't think that is the scenario now for the next couple of months. But that definitely remains a risk going forward.
Right, let's just pause there and look at some of the responses on the Twitter sphere to the news of the summons at the gathering today that Pravin Gordhan was addressing. He revealed the news that he had been summoned by the NPA.
Well, that's just some of the feedback that we see there on social media. And Daniel Silk, we did speak to him earlier on today to get his perspective. And as you can tell, his commentary is that, again, shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to trying to create some kind of certainty in the South African market. And just very briefly, as we do wrap up, again, we saw the fundamentals of South Africa's competitiveness as an economy being indicated in the World Economic Forum competitiveness report, moving up 2 slots from 149 to 147, and the reaction to Pravin Gordhan's roadshow with CEOs just last week. But we'll leave it there as we continue with our analysis of the market dynamics and reaction to the Finance Minister receiving a summons this morning. A big thank you once more to Dylan Bester, Director at Phoenix Private Wealth International, and Tertia Jacobs, Treasury Economist at Investec Corporate and Institutional Bank.